Hello and welcome back to All About Russia. My name is Andrew, and in this video we're going to be looking at one of the republics nestled in the Caucasus Mountains, the Kabardino-Balkar Republic. The Kabardino-Balkar Republic is located in the south of Russia, in the North Caucasian Federal District and the North Caucasian Economic Region. It is the 78th largest federal subject at 4,800 square miles in size, making it larger than the island nation of Vanuatu. It has a population of over 900,000, making it the 57th most populous part of the Russian Federation and making it more populous than the nation of Fiji. It is notable as one of only 11 republics in the Russian Federation that has Russians as a minority, standing at just under 20%. In addition to Russian, both the Kabardian dialect of the Adygia language and the Balkar dialect of the Karachi-Balkar language are official in the Republic and are widely spoken by both communities. The Kabardino-Balkar Republic is bordered by the Stavropol Krai to the North Ossetian Alanian Republic to the east, the Karachay-Cherkess Republic to the west, and the nation of Georgia to the south. Over half the territory is mountainous, with over 12 mountains in the region, 5 of which stand at over 4,000 meters tall. In fact, the tallest mountain in not just the whole of Europe, but the whole of Russia is located here as well, being Mount Elbrus. This mountain is so huge it actually spills over into the neighbouring Karachay-Cherkess Republic. Its name is a little bit unclear, one theory suggesting it's come from the Persian term Halborz, meaning high peak. To the Kabardians, this is the holy mountain, whereas the Balkars call it Mingitau, or Eternal Mountain. Forests make up over 15%, but land on the plough stands at 23%. This does make sense as agriculture is the biggest industry in the region, watered by many of the rivers that flow through the Republic. The longest river in the region is not the Terek, but the Malka, called the Balk and Balk Sul respectively in Kabardian and Balkar. In both languages, the river's name means something along the lines of Fish River. The Republic is divided into 10 administrative districts, with the capital Nalchik at its own administrative centre. Whilst the administration is not specifically run on an ethnic basis, Balkars dominate in only 2 districts, the Elbrus and Cherksari districts, with Russians in the Maiksy and Prokhalensky districts, with Kabardians dominating elsewhere. The Kabardino-Balkar Republic is an oddity in that it is essentially 2 republics in one. We will explore this oddity a little bit later on in this video. The flag of the Republic is made of 3 horizontal lines of blue, white and green, with an emblem of Mount Elbrus in the middle. The blue is to represent the Balkars and the rivers of the land, the white peace, and the green both Kabardians and Islam, the dominant religion of the region. This flag was adopted on the 21st of July 1994, and the entire region runs on Moscow Standard Time. The Republic does have an anthem which is playing right now, and I will include it in the description below for those of you interested. The first archaeological evidence of human settlement in the Kabardino-Balkar Republic comes from the village of Belaya Rechka and date back somewhere around 70,000 years. Who these early humans were, it is impossible to know. What we do know is that the Bronze Age makeup culture extended to this region, arriving around 2000 BC. As we mentioned in our video way back on the Adygia Republic, which you can check out over here, this was a Bronze Age trade network as well as culture, and put them into contact as far away as places as Mesopotamia. Our first written records of the region come from the 1st century BC, when the Greek geographer Strabo recorded the Zyx, possibly the forerunners of the Adygia, living in a swathe of land to the mountains, allegedly since the 6th century BC. Throughout this video, I will be interchanging 3 terms: Kabardian, Circassian, and Adygia. As I explained in our video on the Adygia, all 3 of these terms are essentially the same thing, with the Kabardians being a tribe of the Circassians, as we call them in English, or Adygia in their native tongue. And this is where immediately it gets a little controversial. Depending on who you ask, you'll be told that the Circassians have always lived in this area, and it was the Balkars who were ultimately invaders and arrived later on. Likewise, you could actually hear the exact opposite, that the Balkars have always been here and the Circassians are the ones who invaded the land. As no one can actually prove who was here first, for the sake of objectivity, we are simply going to repeat what is recorded, what archaeological evidence has been found, and what was written. Whoever was living here, there was a large blank space in the early history of the region. The arrival of the Huns, their displacement, and everything in between is a mystery. What we do know is that by the mid-7th century AD, a new power had arisen, the Khazars. As mentioned in previous videos, the Khazars were a nomadic Turkic-speaking people who solidified themselves as the ruler of the steppe, centered on the modern Volga heartland. Their control spread to the Caucasus, where numerous people swore fealty to the terrifying horse lords. The role of the region during the Arab Wars is a little unclear. It could well be that men from the region were rotated to defend against the Arab incursions. It could be that they were entirely unaffected. What we do know is that in the 9th century, when the back of the Arab invasion had been broken, the Kingdom of Alania, a vassal of the Khazars covering much of the North Caucasus, broke free. The Alans who ruled this kingdom are the ancestors of the Ossetian people. They spoke an Iranian language, ruling over various mountainous tribes in the region. Interestingly, in the 10th century, the Persian explorer Ibn Rastur actually visited this kingdom, noting that whilst the king was Christian, and some of his nobles were, most of the people were still pagans. What was also noted in this visit was the influence of the neighbouring kingdom of Georgia, possibly the source of this Christianization. During the Middle Ages, Georgia had a surprising level of influence among the peoples of the Caucasus. As we saw in our video on the Republic of Ingushetia, which you can check out over here, the Georgian nobility intermarried with many of the peoples of the Caucasus, spreading Christianity with them. It is also from this report that we get a little more information on the people living in the region. Ibn Rastur recorded the Tulas people as living in the region. This possibly is a reference to the Balkars, as Tulas is an old Turkic term for mountaineer. Later Russian sources recorded the Kosogi living in the area, an old term for Circassians. Not only is it hard to understand who truly was living here at this time, it's also quite hard to estimate the extent of Christianity. We are aware from Georgian records that missionaries were active in the future Kabardino-Balkar Republic throughout the 11th and 12th centuries, but their level of success is impossible to estimate. As we saw in our video on the English Republic, intermarriage with the aristocracy often led to a downward trickle of Christianity. Kings converting, then their nobles converting, then their knights converting, and going further down the chain. However, one of the reasons this is so hard to estimate is there is very little left to look at. And the reason there is very little left to look at came in the 13th century. In 1242, the Mongolian hordes poured into the region, decimating Alania and laying waste to everything within reach. As we mentioned in our video on the Balkar people, this invasion likely drove them into the mountains and away from the more fertile lowlands. Whatever Georgian influence in the region existed was destroyed, with the lowlands falling under the control of the Mongols. The Mongolians did not have a great interest in large swathes of empty territory. What they wanted were communities they could extract tithes from, and this led to the Caucasian lowlands becoming something of a no man's land. Nominally claimed by the Georgians, the cycle of violence would continue, as settlers would move down from the mountains, only to be attacked months later by Tatar forces, who would then drive them back into the mountains. This cycle repeated throughout the next century. What is important to note is that the Alanian kingdom, even though it ultimately survived up until Tamerlane's arrival in 1395, was destroyed. But the people who lived in it were not. Some communities never left, repelling Tatar attacks as best they could. So too were these communities not abandoned by the Georgians, who, through dynastic legitimacy, assumed overlordship of these communities. Indeed, an inscription dating from this time has been found in the Georgian script, from the Bashir people, giving praise to God. Yet there is no question that Georgian influence in the region was severely damaged during the invasions. In 1333, a letter from Pope John XXII was sent to the Grand Prince of the Circassians, Vazacht, praising him for the spread of Catholicism in his realm. This is quite odd, as before their conversion to Islam, the Circassians were largely an Orthodox people. What this letter suggests is that the influence of the Georgians had somehow been broken on the Circassian, and other influences, perhaps from the Genovese influence in Crimea, was playing a greater role. Around the year 1400, after Tamerlane had thoroughly depopulated the region and weakened his Mongolic rival Toktamish, a great migration occurred. A powerful people, organised and prepared to fend off the Tatars, arrived in the region. The Kabardians are one of the 12 historic Circassian tribes, and take their name arguably from the name of a historic prince of the Adygia, Kabardey. They arrived and settled in the vacant lowlands, raising horses and sheep before being unified into a greater Circassian state in 1427 under King Inal the Great. Yet, according to Kabardian sources, there was no migration. They had lived in the area since the time of Strabo's writings. In fact, they say, if there was a migration, it came from the east, with Mongolic Turkic tribes settling in the region, the forefathers of the Balkars. To the Circassians, they did not migrate to the lowlands, simply returning to it, leaving the Turkic remnants to live in the mountains. This is quite controversial, as there is very little evidence to support either argument, yet nationalists will fiercely cling to these narratives. What is undisputable is that, as of the 15th century, the Kabardians were on the advent. The most fertile land, the majority of the trade routes, and their language grew in prominence. Circassian society was tribal and inherently separate. Upon the death of King Inal, the Kabardians reverted to a state of autonomy, nay, independence. With the Kabardians in the lowlands and the Balkars in the highlands, an uneasy truce was arranged. Neither society welcomed the other, but both feared the devastating and brutal raids of the Tatars from Crimea or the Nogai to the north. In fact, the first mention of Russia comes into the history of the region around this time. Seeking a powerful ally against the Crimean raids, the Kabardian prince Temrik Udar married his daughter Maria to Ivan the Terrible in 1561. This cemented an anti-Tatar alliance, but the Circassians would struggle to keep Ottoman and Crimean influence from the region. In fact, the relationship between the Kabardians and the Crimean Tatars was quite a turbulent one. At times, the Crimeans pressured the Kabardians for tribute, other times trading freely with them. The Ottomans especially recruited Circassians into their ranks, both as soldiers and for the harem, and by the end of the 16th century had unofficial overlordship of the region. As we have seen in some of our other videos, such as that on the Avars, which you can check out over here, Ottoman missionaries were active in the Caucasus from around the 16th century. Many of the nearer Circassian tribes on the coast had adopted Islam as a result, a byproduct of close trade and relations, as we've seen in the history of other places such as Indonesia and Oman. Yet in the land of the future Kabardino-Balkar Republic, the Ottomans found an obstacle. The close ties between the Kabardians and the Russians, shared both dynastically and by faith, made conversion almost impossible. There is some evidence that the Balkars were already Muslim at this point, possibly as a legacy of the last years of Mongol rule. But if this is true, their role is still a very minor one, locked away in the mountains behind a sea of Orthodox peoples. In fact, this positive relationship between the Kabardians and the Russians allowed the Russians to travel the extent of the vast Circassian lands with relative ease. In 1629, a Russian expedition was made to Balkaria, where silver ore had been discovered. This prompted an interest from the Russian crown in this distant mountainous land, and one that would be realised nearly 2 centuries later. A turning point in the region came about in 1708. Despite paying hefty tribute to the Ottoman Sultan since the mid-16th century for protection, the Khan of Crimea, Kaplan-Garai, still raided the region for slaves for the Crimean slave markets. The Crimeans at this point were vassals of the Sultan and thus obligated to respect the exemption. Yet in 1699 they still conducted raids. As we explained in our video on the Republic of Crimea, which you can check out over here, slaves and the profits they brought were essential for the functionality of the Crimean state, and thus the Khan simply could not stop raiding, not without serious fractures for his own society. In addition to 1699, there were further raids in 1700 and 1703. The Kabardians were outraged and appealed to the Sultan, who promised an end to the raiding, but did nothing. The Crimeans were a powerful vassal, who brought far more to the table than the Kabardians, who were not even actually vassals at this point, did. And thus, under the leadership of their elected prince, Kurgoka Atatürk, they began to fight back. In 1707, Crimean forces that arrived in Kabardia were violently opposed by the Circassians, being chased off by organised units of Circassian cavalry, and the annual tribute to the Sultan cancelled. This led the Ottoman Sultan, Ahmed III, to send a force to pressure the Kabardians to pay their tribute. Under the leadership of the Crimean Tatar Kaplan-Garai, anywhere from 20 to 30,000 Ottoman soldiers marched into the modern Kabardino-Balkar Republic. The Circassians cleverly lured the soldiers into the centre of Kabardia before turning on them at the Battle of Kanzal, inflicting an enormous defeat that sent shockwaves throughout the Caucasus. The role Balkars played here is debated, but what is clear is that this became a turning point in Kabardian independence. No longer would they be prey to the neighbouring Tatars and Ottomans. Faced with a new reality, the Ottomans tried a different approach. Missionaries from both the Ottoman Empire and the Crimean Khanate were ordered to spread the Quran among the Circassians, preaching to the nobility, who often had trade or even family connections to the Muslim elite. This took root, and a steady wave of Islamization of the Kabardians occurred. The Russo-Turkish War of 1735, ironically brought about in part by the unrestricted Crimean Tatar raiding, and its end in 1739 brought greater freedom for the region as well. As part of the Treaty of Belgrade, Kabardia was recognised as an independent state, and officially declared outside of the influence of both the Ottomans and Russia. Kabardian independence allowed them to prosper, trading with both the Ottomans across the Black Sea and the Russians to the north. In 1774, the Treaty of Kuchuk-Karnaka changed the status of Kabardia, ceding influence to the Russians. Despite the Kabardians having nothing to do with the Russian-Turkish conflict, this treaty in some ways sealed their fate. By putting them squarely in Russia's sphere of influence, no longer would they be suffering from slave raids or demanding tithes, but instead a far worse fate: genocide. In 1785, the Russian Caucasian Governorate was established, expanding upon the previous Astrakhan Governorate, and the theoretical governance of the entire Caucasus region made. The Russian government had had an interest in the Caucasus region dating back to the days of Peter I, and whilst Russian presence was at first light, permission was given for Cossacks to move into the region. As we mentioned in our video on the Adigya, which you can watch over here, with the arrival of the Cossacks, a cycle of raiding and counter-raid developed. Circassians might steal horses, leading to Cossacks to attack an Adigya village. Or a Cossack might take a herd of goats, and that leads to a Kabardian assault on a stanitsa. It is impossible to say who struck first, both people groups having a long history of raiding their neighbours. But by the turn of the century, a once mutual defensive alliance was churned in the dirt, and war was on everyone's lips. The nature of the Kabardian-Russian relationship had changed. No longer were they two orthodox regional powers combining against a common foe, now there was one Orthodox empire and one Islamic tribal society stopping hegemony in the Caucasus. Whilst the battles raged up and down Circassia, this video is about the history of the Kabardino-Balkar Republic, and so I will only be mentioning things that happened here. In 1804, disease broke out in Kabardia. As a result, a cordon was established by the Russians, a cordon that prevented Circassian herdsmen from grazing their sheep, but allowed Cossacks to do so. This led to conflict and famine, killing many. In 1810, a punitive raid was organised under General Bulgakov into Kabardia. This punitive rage was fueled arguably by other Circassian attacks along the defensive line, and led to him destroying dozens of villages and killing thousands. This becomes something of a theme. Under General Yermolov, punitive raids continued into Kabardia to punish the Circassians for their resistance in 1818, 1820 and 1821. And the keyword here is organised. Unlike Mongol raids in the past to plunder or Tatar raids to kidnap, these were extremely methodical. In closing forces on Kabardian walls, the Circassians were surrounded and given a bleak choice: expulsion or death. In our video on the Adiga, we spoke at length about how the Circassians fought a fighting retreat, and many opted to leave at first for lands further west, but later on for the Ottoman Empire. In Kabardia, more made that choice. This, in hindsight, was the best of a bad situation, and meant at the end of the Caucasian Wars, the Kabardians were one of the largest tribes still remaining, both in the Russian Empire as well as in Turkey. At this point, it is worth remembering that entire tribes of Circassians were wiped out during this war. As mentioned in our video on the Balkars, Russian rule was cemented in the region in 1828, after ravaging the Malkar Gorge and forcing the Balkar elders to swear fealty. As part of the pacification of the region, a series of forts and checkpoints were set up, including one in 1818 on the site of Nalchik. It is worth mentioning here that a settlement had existed on this site about a century earlier. As such, there is a little bit of a debate about who actually founded Nalchik. The name itself has a core Circassian root, Nal being the Kabardian word for horseshoe. However, another argument put forward is that the Russians truly founded it, as the foundations of the city were built by themselves in 1818. Whilst the Circassians in the west still resisted, the Russians began to organise their new territory. In 1832, the lands north of the Malka River were put into the Stavropol Krai, the lands south still a part of the Caucasian Cordon. By 1860, the entire region was put into the Terek Oblast, pacified of any native resistance and open to Cossack expansion. Whilst the Balkars remained largely in place, as a part of their undesirable land and acquiescence to Russian demands, most of the Kabardians had gone. Those few who had remained, and those who trickled in from the west, lived on the periphery of Cossack society. They were excluded from the very land that had once been their most fertile, living on land unclaimed by their new Cossack hosts. Many of the Orls and towns in Kabardia had been resettled with Cossack, Russian, Ossetian and even Georgian settlers. This was so much so that in 1865 the Terek Cossack host was raised on the region, a defensive force designed to keep the natives in their place. In 1871, Nalchik had transformed from a fortress into a town. Rather than just soldiers, it was inhabited by craftsmen, teachers and government officials. For the next 40 years, the region endured a suffocating peace. Kabardians and Balkars, as Muslim Caucasians, were not permitted into many aspects of Russian life, and lived essentially as second-class citizens. It was not until the revolution of 1905 that things began to change. In the 1897 census of the region, only 9% of the Terek Oblast identified as Kabardian speakers. The substantial Cossack majority in the region provided a bulwark against any worries of native encroachment. So too have the survivors of the genocide actually integrated into the Russian society as best they could. This was so much so that at the outbreak of the First World War, it was Kabardians who put forward the idea of a native Caucasian cavalry, something that would develop into the Wild Division. The First World War and the Russian Revolution that followed would bring great changes to the lands of the future Kabardino-Balkar Republic, as it did throughout the Tsarist Empire. With the abdication of the Tsar in March of 1917, the region declared for the provisional government, but by November, that had changed. The growing lawlessness in the region prompted the land south of the River Malk to join the Union of Peoples of the Northern Caucasus, evolving into the Mountainous Republic of the North Caucasus. The lands north of the Malk found themselves as part of the Turkic Soviet Republic in March of 1918, growing into the North Caucasian Soviet Republic by July. This was a bloody time, and as well as there being political tensions, there were ethnic ones as well. One of the reasons that the Union of Highland People had come together was the growing lawlessness, where Cossacks were pretty much just killing them at random. Likewise, there was great tension from the urban Soviet forces and the rural Cossack ones. During this time, a lot of the restrictions that had been put on the Kabardians and Balkars were lifted due to the sheer manpower issues. The deteriorating situation and demand for manpower led to both ethnic groups being incorporated in part into Soviet, White, and their own Highland forces. The White Army under General Denikin pushed into the region, having taken the neighbouring North Caucasian Soviet Republic in August of 1918. Whilst nominally under White control, most of the efforts were put in invading the Bolsheviks to the north, and a low-level guerrilla campaign did occur in much of the Caucasus region. The White invasion failed, and by January 1921, the lands were firmly under Soviet control. It is interesting to see how this Soviet rule was approached by many of the indigenous peoples of the region. The lawlessness of the last few years and dominance of the hated Cossack class for 40 years before this led to there being little love lost for the white cause. Soviet promises of autonomy and indigenous self-rule proved for many more appealing than a return to Cossack hegemony. In January 1921, the region joined the Mountain People's Autonomous Republic, being demarked as the Kabardin Autonomous Oblast within that republic. Nalchik at this point had grown so large and prosperous to be declared the capital of this new region. The following year, the Balkars were enfranchised, and the region was renamed the Kabardino-Balkar Autonomous Oblast. With the removal of the Mountain People's Autonomous Republic, the region was incorporated into the North Caucasian Krai, a Soviet attempt at balancing indigenous numbers with Slavic interests. Of note, both the Balkar and Kabardian languages were given official status around this time, part of the indigenization process proclaimed by the Soviets. On the 5th of December 1936, it was removed and created into its own autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, the Kabardino-Balkar ASSR. The restructuring of administration over the last 10 years was primarily economic. As part of the 5-year plans, redrawing lines and boundaries to suit the various economic necessities of each region was the norm. There is, however, another part to this. The Kabardians and the Balkars are not the same ethnic group. The Kabardians and the Circassians are, and the Balkars and the Karachay are. Yet, in both of these republics, they are mixed. Why? As was the case in the neighbouring Karachay-Cherkess ASSR, or even the Krasnodar Krai to the north, a specific ethnic division was created in the administration of the region. The reason for this is simple: divide ut regnes, divide so you may rule. After the Caucasian Wars, the Russian Empire had moved the Cossacks into the region to remove the danger of the Caucasian peoples, creating large loyalist blocks between the tribes. During the Civil War, that danger had re-emerged in the idea of the Union of Highlanders, and the Soviets had seen how quickly inter-ethnic Muslim communities had bonded together. This could and would not stand in the new Soviet utopia. By rearranging the borders to create both a linguistic barrier as well as an administrative barrier, the Soviets divided the Caucasian people, in this case the Turkic and Circassian peoples, keeping them in a republic with the other. As Sovietization began, factories and schools were built in the region. Mosques were closed and access outside the region heavily scrutinized. On the 22nd of June 1941, Operation Barbarossa began, and an enormous Nazi force crossed over into the Soviet Union. Waves of refugees arrived daily, seeking safety in the far mountains. But by November 1942, the Germans had reached the Kabardino-Balkar ASSR. Despite fierce fighting, the entire region was occupied by Nazi forces in August 1942. The Republic wouldn't be fully cleared of German forces until January 1943. This means that for nearly 6 months, the region was administrated by the Germans, an unacceptable period of time. As we have mentioned in our video on the English and Chechens, this was unacceptable to Joseph Stalin. The only conceivable reason the Germans had occupied the area so easily was collaboration, and Stalin's eyes fell on the Balkars. As we mentioned in our video on the Balkars, the fact the Balkars had been repressed rather thoroughly during the purges had already put them in a negative light. Seen as unreliable already, a report from the secretary of the Kabardino-Balkar ASSR, Zubko, an ethnic Kabardian in February 1944, blamed the German success in the region to assistance from the Balkar population at large, and a failure to sabotage products left for the invaders. Now, in fairness, this may have been a statement that was already written for him by the NKVD under Lavrenti Beria and simply his signature put on it. But regardless, this was the nail in the coffin for the Balkar people. On the 8th of March 1944, the entire Balkar population, men, women and children, were rounded up and deported to Central Asia. The Balkar name was removed from the Republic's name and the borders revised, the Georgian SSR gaining the Elbrus and the Gorny districts. For 12 long years, the land was exclusively Kabardian in name, though naturally other ethnic groups from the Soviet Union were moved to the region as well, including Russians, Ukrainians, Ossetians and Georgians. It is worth noting that the Kabardians themselves were not entirely exempt. Around 2,500 Kabardians were deported also, primarily for having been associated with the Islamic revival that took place under German rule. There is an argument that the Kabardians themselves were planned to be deported as well, their role in retaking the region from German forces, and the possible scapegoating of the Balkar people prevented this. This is highly controversial, and the exact plans for the Kabardians Balkars cannot be known. What we do know is the Balkars were refused permission to return to their mountains, and the Kabardians giving free rein. In 1956, the Balkars, along with other deported people of the USSR, were allowed to return. This is a matter of some controversy as well. During the deportation, Kabardian auxiliaries had been used to supplement the NKVD forces, and during their long absence, Kabardians have begun living on formerly Balkar territory. Today, the Kabardians are the majority in the Republic, and some Balkars argue that this majority only came about due to their deportations. Kabardian nationalists argue that the Balkars have always been in the minority. As always, the truth is hard to gather. What we do know is that from this point onward, the 5 traditional Balkar communities were depleted, and Kabardians carried the majority of the region. Ethnic identity, at least in Soviet eyes, was a relic from the past, and the introduction of large metallurgy and production centres across the region helped foster a Soviet identity. How deep this identity went is hard to say. Whilst their time in exile had hardened the Balkar people to an endearment of the Soviet state, the Kabardians too had a legacy of expulsion and repression under the Russians. In 1968, as a reaction to severe police brutality, riots broke out in Nalchik requiring state intervention. This prompted a relaxation of non-Slavic persecution. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, life in the Republic continued apace. The gradual slowing of the economy, the rise in alcoholism and shortages reached its zenith in the 1990s, and after the introduction of glasnost, both Kabardian and Balkar nationalism resurfaced. Whilst not as violent as in places such as Chechnya or Dagestan, a drift of the Slavic communities back to Russia proper occurred, dropping the Russian community from 30% to under 20% today. In 1991, as part of a last-ditch effort to keep the Union, the ASSR was made into an SSR, with all the rights and privileges that entailed. Nevertheless, the Soviet Union fell, and in 1992, the Kabardino-Balkar Republic joined the Russian Federation. By 1993, the economic turmoil of the last few years was at its worst, and a great deal of poverty affected the Republic. Factories closed, and alternative jobs were not found, as nationalism and Islamization rose. Unlike in some of their neighbouring communities, demonstrations by nationalists were largely peaceful. The Kabardians sought unity with their Circassian brothers, whilst the Balkars sought union with the Karachi, their ethnic brothers. Wahhabist money only trickled into the region in small amounts, gaining a very small following. This helped keep part of the stability, and a power-sharing agreement was signed in 1994 with the Russian Federation, giving the Republic more freedom in its economic and political measures, and helped to satisfy somewhat calls for autonomy or even separation. It should be noted that unlike in places like Chechnya, there were no real independence movements in the Kabardino-Balkar Republic. People were aware, however, of how control from Moscow had strangled the economy, and thus more freedom and independence in that regard was desired. The outbreak of war in Chechnya quashed any pseudo-republican ideas and secured the region as part of the loyal Caucasus. Despite not sharing a border with Chechnya, refugees did arrive in the region, and this, as we saw in our Ingushetia video, which you can check out over here, weighed on the already tight economic situation. As mentioned before, the influence of Wahhabist money in the region was minimal, the Eastern Caucasus being the primary focus of this. Nevertheless, the defeat of Russia in the First Chechen War sent many flocking to the centre of a potentially new Islamic state, including from the Kabardino-Balkar Republic. After the defeat of Chechnya in the Second Chechen War, the Republic became home to anti-terrorist activity. This was especially welcomed after the 2005 bombing attack in Nalchik. Interestingly, whilst the attack was blamed on the Chechens, there is some evidence to support the idea that this was a domestic terrorist incident fueled by Kabardians who had been radicalized during their time in Chechnya. As security improved and Russia's economic situation developed, more money flowed into the region, helping to remove some of the poverty. In 2002, the power-sharing agreement was rescinded by a strong central Russian state. This was not massively opposed, as by this point the region had not been able to develop its own economic potential and was reliant on the state for support. With the end of Soviet rule and the flight of many of its Slavic settlers, the Kabardino-Balkar Republic has taken on more of an indigenous character. Both the Kabardian and Balkar languages are officially used in the Republic by each community. Of note, both communities have lived fairly harmoniously with each other. Unfortunately, since the decline of the Soviet Union, the region, which was never particularly wealthy, has become quite a poor place, ranking 75th in 2020 by GDP. This has led to it regularly needing federal financial assistance and a flight of its young people to the more prominent cities along the Don and in central Russia. Agriculture is the largest industry in the region, employing nearly 50% of the workforce. Manufacturing still does contribute to the economy, but it is very much small potatoes. What is a much larger industry, however, is hydroelectrical production. The region is entirely self-sufficient with regards to energy. In fact, the region can produce so much electricity that it sells some to its nearby neighbours, notably Ingushetia, who, if you remember from our video on Ingushetia, does not have the capacity to create their own energy. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, one industry that has taken off is tourism. In addition to the beautiful landscapes and dramatic gorges of the region, it holds one of the most common approaches to Mount Elbrus, and both domestic and international mountaineers seek out hotels, cabins and B&Bs in the Republic as their base of operations. The population of the Republic is just under 1 million people as of the last census. This is actually up from the 2010 census by around 500,000 people. This makes it the 57th most populous part of the Russian Federation. The Kabardians are the ethnic majority in the region at 57.1%, with Russians at just over 20%, followed by Balkars at over 13%. Technically, the Circassian population is actually over 60%, as 3% identified as Turkic, the Russian term for Circassian, but these may well have been Adigia of non-Kabardian extraction. The remaining 6.7% is made up of a variety of people such as Ukrainians, Ossetians, and Chechens. As of the 2012 survey, Islam is the majority religion at over 70% of the Republic adhering to it. Christians make up over 15%, with Orthodoxy the majority at 11%. Both people who are spiritual and those who are not spiritual both make up around 5% each, with the remaining amount being from indigenous faiths and non-answers. The birth rate in the Republic is 1.67 children per woman, which is higher than the national average. Unfortunately, drug abuse too is higher than the national average, at 18 incidents per 100,000 people. Alcoholism is, however, lower than the national average, at only 86 incidents per 100,000. This is possibly due to the Islamic nature of the Republic. The head of the Republic is Kazbek Kokov, an ethnic Circassian of Kabardian extraction. He is actually the son of the first president of the Republic, Valery Kokov, and has been in power since 2019. Kazbek was born in the Republic and is, of course, a member of the United Russia Party. The Kabardino-Balkar Republic has a very dramatic history, and so too does it have a very dramatic landscape. Should you manage to visit, one of the main attractions of the region are the mountains themselves. There are 5 mountains in the Republic, all over 5,000 kilometers, making it a mecca for mountaineers. Aside from mountains, the land is full of dramatic gorges and waterfalls, some of the most scenic being the Chegem waterfall, the Gedmish waterfall, and the State Natural Reserve, with insane views like this. As previously mentioned, the region has taken on more of an indigenous character, and Nalchik in the summer is a unique blend of Circassian food and musical traditions with Turkic entertainment and hospitality. The Kabardino-Balkar Republic is a shining example of how historical injustices can affect the modern day, but how people can overcome these and thrive. Thank you for watching. My name is Andrew. Up next is the Kaliningrad Oblast. Paka!